You think medieval marriage was about love? Think again. Imagine a world where I do often began with kidnapping, rape, and the law nodding along. In medieval Europe, the word raptus meant abduction, violation, and forced marriage rolled into one. And disturbingly, courts often rewarded the kidnappers. Heiresses were snatched from their beds, dragged across borders, and persuaded to consent before a priest who knew the ransom involved her dowry. In 1288, English statutes tried to crack down, but families still fought bloody private wars to undo these crimes. Ready to uncover the horror? Let's plunge into the twisted truth. You think words are stable? In the Middle Ages, even the word rape meant something far darker and more slippery. The Latin raptus didn't just mean sexual assault. It meant abduction, seizure, or carrying off by force. Which meant that when a knight dragged a woman screaming from her father's hall, courts could debate whether he was guilty of a crime or had just started a valid marriage. Imagine Tinder where kidnapping counts as a proposal. That was the nightmare. Legal records from 12th, 13th century England, France, and Italy are full of cases where wealthy heiresses were targeted not because of love, but because of land. A nobleman could grab a girl, claim they had consented in private, and suddenly the church faced a choice: defend her family's honor, or bless a union that conveniently transferred property to a powerful man. Too often, the altar won. Even worse, abduction and rape could be retroactively whitewashed by marriage. A woman's yes whispered under duress in a bishop's chamber might erase the kidnapping and violence that came before. For medieval law, property and lineage mattered more than a woman's screams, but this was only the foundation. Soon, raptus would evolve into something even more sinister, a weapon of political warfare, where stealing a bride meant stealing an entire inheritance, and the church itself became an accomplice. If you think gold and jewels made you a target, try being born a teenage heiress in medieval Europe. Land was the currency of power, and daughters who inherited estates were basically walking treasure chests. A man didn't need to win a war or negotiate a treaty. He could just kidnap the girl who held the key to a fortune. That's exactly what raptus offered: a shortcut to instant wealth. Court rolls from England in the late 13th century drip with examples. In 1288, Parliament even tried to tighten the laws because powerful families were furious that heiresses were being dragged from castles, bundled onto horses, and rushed to remote chapels before their guardians could intervene. The abductor's goal wasn't passion, it was paperwork. Get her in front of a priest, force a consent, and suddenly her estate was legally his. Imagine being 15, snatched from your bed in the dark, your hands bruised from the ropes, only to be told that the church now recognized your captor as your husband. To resist wasn't just scandalous, it was often impossible. Family honor, lineage, and inheritance were on the line, and annulments were expensive, humiliating, and uncertain. But the real horror was still to come. These weren't isolated family feuds. They escalated into violent private wars, with fathers, brothers, and uncles shedding blood to rescue abducted brides. And sometimes, the bride herself wasn't even rescued. If you think abduction was just a family scandal, think again. It could ignite bloodshed on a scale that made neighbors tremble. In medieval Europe, a stolen bride was never just a woman lost. She was land, soldiers, and political leverage suddenly snatched away. That meant her family would not take it lying down. They answered with steel. Take the Anglo-Norman barons of the 13th century. Records tell of heiresses dragged across county borders and hidden in crumbling fortresses, their families rallying armed retainers to storm the gates. These weren't romantic rescues. They were miniature wars. Picture peasants hiding in their cottages as two noble factions clashed in muddy fields, all because some knight wanted to seize an inheritance through forced marriage. Blood stained the soil long before any wedding vows were mumbled. Sometimes, even kings got drawn in. Edward I of England issued ordinances against forcible abduction after noble families complained the practice was destabilizing entire regions. But punishment was selective. If the kidnapper was politically useful, the law mysteriously looked away, justice bent like a reed in the wind of power. And the real twist? Sometimes families fought not to rescue the girl, but to secure the abduction for themselves, choosing to accept the marriage if it meant aligning with a new, stronger ally. The bride was simply the battlefield. If you're hoping the medieval church swooped in like a protector, brace yourself. The church was often the machine that turned abduction into marriage. After all, canon law hinged on one fragile word: consent. If a girl, terrified, beaten, or simply cornered, murmured yes in front of a priest, the union became indissoluble. That whisper erased the kidnapping, the bruises, even the rape. In the eyes of God, she was now a wife to. Ecclesiastical courts across Europe became battlefields of semantics. Families begged bishops to annul forced marriages, presenting evidence of violence and coercion. But judges often shrugged. If the bride said, "I consented," even under duress, courts leaned toward ratifying the union. The logic: better to sanctify a scandal than to fracture the sanctity of marriage. Consider the English Statute of Westminster II, 1285, which condemned abduction of wards with property. Yet church courts could still override secular penalties if consent was found. Kidnappers knew the loophole. Drag the girl to a secluded chapel, pressure her into agreeing, and by the time her family stormed in with swords, the deed was spiritually done. Imagine today's justice system asking a kidnapped teenager whether she chose her captor, then ruling the crime erased if she nodded. That was medieval law, where the crucifix could bless a kidnapping as holy matrimony. But the horror deepened, because sometimes the law itself wasn't enough. The girl had to prove her resistance in the most humiliating ways imaginable. You think medieval justice was blind? Not when it came to a woman's body. When an abducted bride claimed she had resisted, courts often demanded proof. That meant dragging her humiliation into the open. Some ecclesiastical trials forced women to undergo examinations of their virginity, performed by matrons or midwives appointed by the court. Imagine being marched into a chamber, stripped and prodded, while strangers debated whether your body showed signs of resistance or violation. If they found none, judges might conclude you had gone along willingly. The crime vanished. If you thought virginity checks were degrading, wait until you hear about the trials by Congress. In some parts of France and Italy, a woman and her alleged husband could be ordered to demonstrate consummation before witnesses. Yes, you heard that right. A girl abducted at sword point might be forced into a bedchamber, while priests and officials literally waited in the next room to verify whether she submitted. It was medieval justice crossed with voyeuristic torture. Imagine the psychological horror, knowing that if you resisted, you might be branded rebellious and disobedient. But if you submitted, the court would point to your compliance as evidence of consent. Either way, the outcome favored the abductor. To refuse was scandal. To comply was entrapment. Contemporary records show families sometimes begged for annulments on the grounds of defloration under force. But the bar for proof was impossibly high. Unless she could produce visible wounds or sworn testimony from witnesses of the abduction, her captor's word often prevailed. In effect, medieval courts placed the burden of innocence on the victim, not the perpetrator. Today we'd call this state-sponsored abuse. Back then, it was wrapped in the language of sacrament and legality. The result was chilling: courtrooms that turned crimes into marriages and victims into wives. But sometimes, the families refused to accept this twisted theater, and they fought back with fire and steel. If you think fathers calmly appealed to bishops when their daughters were stolen, think again. More often, they reached for the sword. In medieval Europe, honor was currency, and the abduction of a daughter wasn't just a crime, it was an insult that demanded blood. Chronicles from Gascony, Burgundy, and northern England record noble houses rallying retainers, laying siege to keeps where abductors hid their captives. Sometimes the girl was rescued, sometimes she wasn't. But either way, the fields ran red. A stolen bride was tinder for full-blown feuds. Picture it: a dawn raid on a tower where a knight holds his bride. Her brothers batter the gates, arrows streak through the fog, servants cower in the stables. If the girl survives, she's dragged home like a prize of war. If she doesn't, her death becomes a rallying cry for vengeance. Abduction metastasized into vendetta. Even kings dreaded these private wars. Edward I and later Edward III in England issued stern proclamations against ravishment, not out of sympathy for women, but because the violence destabilized the realm. Yet the statutes rarely stopped ambitious men from trying their luck. The promise of an heiress's estate outweighed the risk of outlawry. But here's the cruel irony: while families fought like lions, some abducted brides found themselves trapped because their captors had powerful allies inside the very institutions meant to protect them. You might think the law eventually caught up with these bride thieves, but often their armor wasn't steel, it was patronage. The higher your rank, the less chance you'd ever see punishment. In fact, sometimes kings and magnates actively shielded the abductors, especially if the marriage strengthened alliances they wanted. Take cases recorded in 14th century England, where knights seized underage wards, girls promised huge inheritances, and hustled them into rushed ceremonies. When their furious guardians sued, the abductors simply pleaded loyalty to a powerful earl or the king's household. Suddenly, charges melted away. The victim's testimony, her bruises, even witnesses of the abduction, could vanish under political pressure. One notorious example involved the de Clare heiresses. After Gilbert de Clare died in 1314, his sisters became 3 of the richest marriage prizes in Europe. Chroniclers describe how rivals schemed to kidnap or coerce them, because marrying one meant seizing entire counties. The crown itself manipulated their futures, doling them out as pawns in political chess, ignoring whether consent was real. Imagine the nightmare. Your kidnapper not only forces a wedding, but the king blesses it because it serves his strategy. To resist wasn't just hopeless, it was treason. In those cases, the courtroom didn't just fail the bride, it actively rewarded her predator. But every now and then, resistance came from unexpected places, even from the women themselves, who found ways to fight back inside this rigged system. Don't picture every abducted bride as silent. Some clawed back control, even in systems rigged against them. Their weapons weren't swords, but petitions, alliances, and sheer defiance. Records from 14th century ecclesiastical courts show women filing for annulments on grounds of force. One Yorkshire case describes a girl dragged to a chapel at knife point. In court, she swore publicly, in front of clerics, that she never gave consent. To prove it, she described her bruises and begged for release. Against the odds, the court dissolved the marriage, though not before her reputation was shredded by gossip. Others resisted in subtler ways. Chronicles mention brides who escaped convent walls where abductors tried to stash them, slipping away in the night to relatives who rallied their cause. In France, some noblewomen used their dowries as bargaining chips, refusing to yield estates unless marriages were annulled. And in a few cases, widows even testified against their abductors years later, ensuring their tormentors died disgraced. But here's the tragic twist. Success stories were rare. For every woman who won annulment, dozens remained trapped, their yes under duress cemented forever. Society admired their courage, yet still demanded obedience to their new husbands. Their victories were celebrated in chronicles precisely because they were exceptions. And when women resisted too openly, the system found a brutal way to silence them, by turning their supposed choice into evidence of sin. Think the nightmare ended if a woman said no. In medieval Europe, that no could make things even worse. Courts often twisted resistance into evidence of sin. If a woman admitted she had been abducted and forced into intercourse, some judges labeled her defiled, and therefore guilty of fornication, even adultery, if she had been betrothed elsewhere. Imagine being punished for your own kidnapping. Chronicles from 13th century France describe cases where abducted women were publicly shamed, paraded as if they had sullied their family's honor, while their abductors walked free after paying token fines. In England, records show that some wards who fought against coerced marriages were accused of disobedience, the ultimate female crime in a patriarchal system. By rejecting her captor, she was also rejecting male authority, an act treated almost like treason against her guardian's will. It gets darker. If a woman successfully escaped and tried to remarry, her abductor could sue to reclaim her as his wife, dragging her reputation back through the courts. Even noblewomen weren't safe. Chroniclers note disputes where lords accused unwilling brides of enticement, as if the kidnapping were their fault. So the trap was complete. Comply, and you became a wife. Resist, and you became a criminal. Either way, your body and reputation were weapons in someone else's war. But sometimes the stakes were higher than honor or reputation. Sometimes entire kingdoms trembled when a bride was stolen. If you thought raptus was just petty lords squabbling, here's the shocker. It could redraw maps. Bride theft wasn't only personal, it was geopolitical. When the victim was a princess or heiress with claims to a throne, her abduction could trigger international crises. In 1386, the heiress Margaret of Dampierre was nearly abducted in Flanders. Why? Because she was the last of her line, her inheritance tied to swaths of territory across modern Belgium. Whoever married her controlled not just wealth, but armies. Chroniclers describe rival factions plotting to seize her carriage, only to be thwarted by guards. Imagine the chaos if they'd succeeded. An entire duchy hijacked by one man's ambition. England saw similar gambits. Noblemen targeted royal wards. Girls under crown custody meant to be parceled into strategic marriages. Seizing one could vault a lesser knight into dangerous power. Edward III's reign was peppered with such scandals, where romantic elopements masked outright abductions with political stakes. Even in Scotland, bride theft rippled through politics. Alliances hinged on controlling heiresses like pawn pieces on a board. A stolen marriage wasn't just about two people. It could realign loyalties, overturn treaties, and plunge neighbors into war. Think about it like corporate mergers today, except instead of boardroom deals, you send armed men to drag a teenage girl from her tower bedroom. But what happened to ordinary people watching these scandals? They didn't just gossip, they learned a chilling lesson about what power could get away with. Picture it. A quiet medieval market town. A girl screams as horsemen thunder past, dragging her away. People freeze, then lower their eyes. Because they know the truth. Speak up, and the abductor's allies might brand you a liar, or worse, an accomplice. That was daily reality for ordinary folk who witnessed raptus. Chroniclers hint at a mix of horror and resignation. Peasants whispered that rich men's quarrels were not our business. A miller's wife in 14th century Normandy testified she'd seen an abduction, but admitted she lied in court, fearing reprisals from the knight's retinue. In England, parish records note donations for rescued maidens, proof that villagers sometimes pooled alms to help abducted girls seek annulments. Compassion existed, but so did fear. Songs and folk tales reveal another coping mechanism: dark humor. Ballads mocked abductors as marriage thieves, half joking, half deadly serious. Imagine laughing at the nightmare because crying changed nothing. For many, abduction was as inevitable as famine or plague. One more hazard of a world ruled by the strong. The silence of bystanders wasn't cowardice, it was survival. Step out of line, and you might end up before the same court that blessed the crime. Better to keep your head down than risk losing it. But while peasants bowed their heads, one force began to stir. Royal lawmakers trying, however feebly, to tame this chaos. By the late 1200s, even kings had had enough. The chaos of stolen brides wasn't just a moral issue, it was destabilizing realms. Enter statutes like Westminster II of 1285 in England, which explicitly outlawed the abduction of heiresses and wards. On parchment, it sounded bold. Anyone guilty of raptus would face prison, fines, and the wrath of the crown. But here's the ugly truth. These laws were more about protecting property than protecting women. The statutes thundered about wardships and inheritances, but barely mentioned the victim's suffering. In practice, punishment often fell on poor men who lacked powerful friends, while noble abductors skated free. Justice bent to wealth like iron to a magnet. Take the case of John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, who in 1316 abducted Maud of Nerford, a noblewoman under royal protection. The scandal rocked England, but the outcome? A slap on the wrist. His status saved him, while Maud's reputation was left in tatters. Westminster II had barked. It did not bite. And when victims tried to invoke the law, the process dragged for years. Families bankrupted themselves in court fees, only to watch judges rule that the marriage stood if any consent, real or coerced, could be proven. So statutes became shields for kings' interests, not swords for women's defense. And the message was clear. The law could be written in ink, but it was enforced in blood. Yet the cycle didn't end with medieval courts. The echoes of raptus lived on, reshaping ideas of marriage for centuries. You might think bride kidnapping died with the Middle Ages. Not quite. Its shadow lingered in customs that still look disturbingly familiar. Romanticized elopements in later centuries often masked the same brutal dynamics. Families whispered of girls running off with their lovers, but chronicles sometimes hint those escapes began with force. The crime was repackaged as passion. Folklore kept the pattern alive too. Ballads of knights stealing maidens, fairy tales of women carried off by princes or beasts. Strip away the sugar, and you see the skeleton of Raptus. It's the same story. Abduction transformed into destiny. Even Shakespeare's comedies toyed with forced marriages, the threat of coercion lingering under the laughter. Legal echoes persisted. In parts of early modern Europe, a man who abducted and slept with a woman could sometimes escape punishment by marrying her. The twisted logic? That marriage restored her honor. Imagine that. The solution to rape was to trap the victim with her attacker for life. Even today, echoes survive in bride kidnapping practices in parts of the world, defended as tradition. The medieval playbook, force followed by coerced consent ratified by law, has proved horrifyingly durable. The truth is, Raptus wasn't just a medieval nightmare. It planted seeds that still grow in cultural soil centuries later. Which begs the question, what does it say about us that marriage and crime have walked hand in hand for so long? Not every abducted bride left behind a tale of annulments or rescue. Many simply vanished into the shadows of history. Chronicles from late medieval Castile tell of noble daughters spirited away by ambitious men who never faced justice. In some records, their names appear once, in a petition or court roll, before disappearing entirely. Their estates changed hands, their bodies, their voices, their futures, silenced. One English case from the 14th century describes a girl named Alice de Lacy, Countess of Lincoln. Heiress to immense wealth, she was abducted not once, but twice, first by a rival baron, later by a powerful magnate who forced her into a humiliating marriage. The law called it ravishment. Chroniclers called it scandal. But Alice's life shows the brutal truth. Abduction wasn't an anomaly. It was a weapon sharpened by politics and greed. Imagine the terror. A woman of the highest rank still dragged screaming from her home, her pleas drowned out by the clatter of hooves. If an heiress with armies and castles at her back could be stolen, what chance did a common girl have? That's the lasting horror of Raptus. It revealed how fragile women's safety truly was in medieval Europe, how marriage itself could become legalized violence, sanctified theft. And it forces us to confront the question, when the altar and the courtroom rewarded abduction, what did that say about the society that built them? From the first scream of a kidnapped heiress to the final whisper of coerced consent, we've walked through a medieval nightmare where marriage and crime were indistinguishable. Let's step back and take in the full picture. We began with a word, raptus, a word that could mean abduction, rape, or marriage depending on who spoke it and who profited from it. That ambiguity was no accident. It was a feature of a system built to serve power. A knight could snatch a bride, a priest could sanctify it, and a court could stamp its seal of approval. All while the victim's voice was drowned out. We saw how heiresses became hostages, their bodies the keys to castles and counties. How families fought bloody feuds, laying siege to towers where their daughters were imprisoned. How villagers whispered, too frightened to intervene, while courts forced women into grotesque tests of virginity or humiliating trials by Congress. We saw how even the highest born, like Alice de Lacy, were dragged from their homes, their fortunes absorbed by predators who wrapped violence in the cloak of matrimony. The laws thundered against abduction. Westminster, too, promised justice. But those words protected estates, not women. Punishment fell hardest on the powerless, while nobles and magnates escaped unscathed. And when victims resisted, they were branded sinners, fornicators, or traitors to their guardian's will. In this twisted world, saying no could destroy you as surely as saying yes. The church, far from a refuge, often turned accomplice. Canon law's obsession with consent meant a single whispered, "I do," wrung from terror, erased every bruise, every scream. It was a system that turned trauma into sacrament. Imagine being told that God Himself had blessed your rape. That was the medieval definition of holy matrimony. And here's the chilling legacy. Raptus didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. Its bones remain in folklore, in romantic tales of stolen brides, in laws that once let rapists escape punishment by marrying their victims, and in modern traditions of bride kidnapping still practiced in parts of the world today. The medieval nightmare is not as far away as we like to believe. So what do we take from this? Gratitude, first of all, that we live in a time where consent is enshrined as the foundation of love and law, not an inconvenient detail to be twisted. Relief that marriage today is, for most of us, a choice, not a cage, but also unease, because the line between tradition and coercion, between romance and possession, is still blurred in too many places. By now you can see why medieval marriage was less fairy tale and more horror show. From heiresses dragged through mud, to courts blessing kidnappers, to families shedding blood over stolen brides, this was love as a battlefield, where women's bodies were prizes to be fought over. So the next time someone sighs about the romance of medieval chivalry, remember the truth. Remember the girl tied across a saddle, bruised and terrified, riding toward a forced wedding she never wanted. Remember the court that asked her to prove her resistance by baring her body. Remember the families who spilled blood because the law was powerless or complicit. And ask yourself, what customs today will seem just as monstrous to future generations? What do we sanctify now, blind to the cruelty embedded within it? Because history's darkest lesson is this: society can wrap horror in ceremony and call it normal. The altar, the courtroom, the crown, each played their part in turning crime into matrimony. So tell me, what shocked you most? The heiresses turned into pawns? The church blessing kidnappers? Or the families who fought private wars over stolen brides? Comment your answer below. And if this journey into the brutal heart of medieval marriage shook you, hit subscribe for more dark history stripped of its fairy tale lies. Like this video if you're glad you're dating in the age of apps, not in the age of abduction. Because one thing's for certain, in the Middle Ages, weddings weren't always celebrations. Sometimes they were crimes written in blood.